once, it seemed that the future of aviation had already arrived. An aircraft that could fly faster than sound, cut transatlantic flights almost in half, and looked as if it had come from another era. Concorde was not just a technical achievement. It became a symbol of a world that wanted more speed, more progress, more impact. But this is exactly where the main paradox begins. The aircraft that was supposed to change flying forever eventually simply disappeared. In the 1960s, aviation lived with the feeling that there were almost no limits left. Passenger aircraft had already connected continents. The jet age had changed the very idea of travel. And now the next logical step seemed to be not just flying farther or carrying more people. The next step seemed to be flying faster, much faster. And it was at that moment that Concorde began to look not like a risky experiment, but like an absolutely natural continuation of everything that was already happening in civil aviation. If the previous decades had taught the world to fly on a mass scale, then Concorde was supposed to teach it to fly almost instantly. It did not just promise to reduce travel time, it offered a new philosophy of flight, one in which the ocean no longer seemed like a serious obstacle, and only a few hours remained between Europe and America. And that was its greatest strength. Concorde was not selling speed alone, it was selling the feeling that the future had already arrived. Everything about it looked unusual. A long pointed nose, an elegant silhouette, wings that did not resemble the traditional broad surfaces of ordinary airliners. Even when it stood on the ground, it gave the impression of a machine that did not belong to its own time, but to some next one. It was not just an airplane, it was the image of progress in its purest form. But the most important thing was that this image was not an empty display. Concorde truly did what it promised. It could fly at speeds above Mach 2, that is, more than twice the speed of sound. Routes that remained long, exhausting journeys for ordinary wide-body aircraft turned into a short leap across the Atlantic for it. And that is why, at the beginning, everything looked almost flawless. The world saw an aircraft that combined engineering boldness, real practical advantage, and incredible prestige. For politicians, businessmen, celebrities, and people used to buying not just a service but a status, Concorde became the perfect symbol of a new era. Flying on it meant not just getting to New York or London faster, it meant literally flying ahead of your time. In a certain sense, Concorde became what the boldest technological breakthroughs were for other industries. It showed what civil engineering was capable of if its goal was not compromise, but the maximum. Most passenger aircraft had always been the result of a balance between price, capacity, range, costs, and profitability. Concorde, by contrast, seemed to be created in a world where the main criterion was the very possibility of surpassing the limit. And that is exactly what made it a legend even before it became clear whether such a model could exist for long. Because in the early years, it seemed that this was only the beginning. Not one exceptional aircraft, but the first representative of a new generation. Many believed that if humanity had already learned to transport passengers at supersonic speed, then sooner or later it would become the new standard. Just as jet aircraft had once pushed out propeller-driven ones, supersonic machines supposedly had to push out ordinary long-haul airliners. This logic contained everything the era of technical optimism loved. If something is faster, more beautiful, and technologically more complex, then that is exactly what the future is. And everything else is only a temporary stage before an inevitable change. And that is where the main illusion was hiding. Because the history of aviation is almost never decided by beauty and speed alone. How can we fly more efficiently? That sounds less romantic, less beautiful, less futuristic. But the fate of Concorde was hidden in exactly that shift. Because from that moment on, it was no longer the herald of a new century, but a reminder of what that century could have been. And the farther aviation moved, the clearer it became. Concorde did not simply outpace its time, it outpaced a version of the future that never actually arrived. And then came what often kills even the boldest projects. The world did not reject Concorde all at once. It did not wake up one morning and say, "We no longer need a supersonic passenger aircraft." No, everything happened much more quietly, much more slowly, and for that very reason, much more dangerously. Because most often, great ideas die not in the moment of loud failure, but in the moment when the world around them simply begins to live by different rules. In the case of Concorde, this showed itself in almost everything. Its main advantage, speed, remained impressive. But with every passing year, it became clearer that the aviation industry itself was being built less and less around impression and more around calculation. And the calculation was ruthless. Concorde could carry far fewer passengers than large long-haul aircraft. Its operation remained expensive. Its fuel efficiency did not look like an advantage, but like a compromise the market did not want to pay for on a mass scale. But perhaps the most important thing was not even that. Concorde could never become a truly universal aircraft, Because of the sonic boom, its supersonic flights over land were heavily restricted, and that immediately cut off a huge share of potential routes. So the aircraft that was supposed to become the symbol of a new stage of global mobility, in reality found itself tied to a fairly narrow set of scenarios. It was incredible. It was legendary, but it was not flexible. And that is probably one of the harshest truths in the history of commercial aviation. You can create a machine the whole world will love, but if it cannot be easily integrated into the logic of the market, it will remain an exception. That is exactly how Concorde gradually transformed from the embodiment of the future into the symbol of a very expensive, very beautiful, but too narrow vision of that future. Then other blows began to accumulate as well. Any system built around a small number of aircraft, a high ticket price, and a special status is always more vulnerable than the mass market. It is harder for it to survive crises, harder to adapt, harder to prove its indispensability in a world where airlines increasingly think not in terms of dreams, but of efficiency. And at some point it became clear, Concorde was no longer moving forward together with the industry. It was as if it had frozen in time. As a work of engineering art, it still inspired admiration. As a symbol of prestige, it still remained unique. But as a model of the future, it had begun to lose. Not because it had become slow, not because it had stopped being beautiful, and not even because it had stopped astonishing people, but because aviation no longer wanted to build its tomorrow around that same dream. And at that moment, Concorde's fate had in fact already been decided. Because when the industry stops seeing you as a direction, you may remain a legend for a while longer, but you will no longer be the future. And in that, perhaps lies the main irony of the whole story. Concorde did not disappear because it was mediocre. Not because it did not impress, and not even because humanity stopped dreaming about speed. It disappeared because in the real world, dreams alone turned out not to be enough. Aviation almost never rewards what merely looks like a breakthrough. It rewards what can be scaled, what can be integrated into the economy, what does not fascinate a few, but works for millions. And that is exactly where Concorde lost. It was too special to become the norm, too expensive to become mass market, too limited to become universal, and at the same time, too beautiful to simply be forgotten. That is why today Concorde is remembered not as just another aircraft of the past. It is remembered as a symbol of the future humanity almost chose, but at the last moment turned in a different direction. Because in the end, aviation made its choice, not in favor of the fastest, not in favor of the most spectacular, and not even in favor of the boldest. It chose what was more profitable, more flexible, and more realistic. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of Concorde. Technology can outpace its time. It can prove that the impossible is possible. It can make the whole world believe that the future has already arrived. But if the world itself is not ready to live by the rules of that future, even the greatest machine will remain only an exception. That is why Concorde left behind not just a legacy of speed. It left behind a far more important question. Does the future always win simply because it is better? And the answer, it seems, is not always the one we would like it to be. Because sometimes it is not the boldest idea that wins, but the one that fits reality better. And perhaps that is exactly why Concorde still fascinates people. Not only because it was incredible, but because it reminds us of a rare moment in history when humanity truly touched the future and still decided to leave it behind.